The folded flag was in the bag at the side of the wheelchair, not displayed, not visible. The flag that had been presented to him at his discharge ceremony 31 years ago at Fort Campbell by a colonel who had read his service record before the ceremony and had said to him afterward, "You carried this well." The flag had been folded by a ceremonial team with the 14 folds, each one deliberate, and placed in the triangular case that held it for the ride home. The case had lived on the shelf above his desk for 31 years through 2 apartments, and the house he had owned for 18 years, and the smaller house he moved to after Margaret died. 4 months ago, his daughter had asked if she could put it in the bag on the wheelchair for the Memorial Day ceremony, and he had said yes. He had not asked why. He had understood. Reginald Moss was 64 years old. He had served in the United States Army for 22 years, retiring as Master Sergeant. He had served in Germany, in the Gulf, in Bosnia, and in Iraq, and he had come home from the last deployment with the injuries that eventually produced the wheelchair. Not all at once, not in a clean line between before and after, but in the way that combat injuries sometimes present themselves, which is slowly over years as the things that held together begin to require more holding than they can provide. He had used a cane for 6 years. He had used a walker for 3. He had been in the wheelchair for the past 2 years, and the wheelchair was not the thing he had feared it would be when he feared it. It was simply the equipment. You use the equipment that the situation requires. He had joined the Army at 22, which was not the youngest you could join, but was the age at which he had been ready in the specific sense of knowing what he was choosing and why he was choosing it, rather than simply being available to be chosen. He had grown up in a neighborhood in Cincinnati where 3 of the boys he had gone to school with had enlisted before him, and he had watched them come home changed in ways that were visible, and he had decided that if he was going to go, he was going to go understanding what he was going toward rather than simply following. He had spent a year after high school working at a warehouse and reading about military service. Reading the accounts, the histories, the service records of men who had served in the ranks and become officers and gone back to the ranks and built careers from the inside rather than from the outside. He had joined knowing he was going to make it a career, which was not what most 22-year-old enlistees knew when they joined. He had been right about the career. 22 years. Master Sergeant. 4 deployments, each one different from the others. In the ways that deployments are different, the geography, the conditions, the nature of what was being asked, the quality of the command above him, and the character of the soldiers below him. He had been below good officers and below poor officers, and he had learned from both because the poor officers taught you what not to do, and the good officers showed you what leadership looked like when it was built from honesty rather than from authority. He had been a good Master Sergeant. He knew this not because someone had told him the Army told you through your evaluations and your promotions, and he had been promoted on time at every grade, which was the institutional signal for the assessment, but because he had known it from the inside, which is the knowing that matters when the institutional signal is not available. He had known it in the way that a leader knows it when they look at the people they are leading and see that the people are doing what needs to be done, not because they were told to, but because they understood why it needed to be done and had made it their own understanding. That was the thing. The making it their own. You could not do that with fear. You could do it with honesty, and with the specific respect that consists of treating the people you lead as intelligent adults who will make good decisions if they understand why the decisions matter. He had retired at 42 and had spent the next 2 years in a disorientation that he had not anticipated, because he had spent 22 years belonging to an institution and had underestimated what belonging to an institution meant for how you organized your sense of yourself. The disorientation had resolved over time into the life he had built afterward, the work he had done in veterans services, the volunteer positions, the gradual construction of a retired life that had its own structure and its own purposes, and that did not require the Army to give it those things. The wheelchair had complicated the structure, not destroyed it, complicated it. He had had to rebuild some of what the mobility loss had changed, and the rebuilding had required the same approach that every rebuilding requires. Look at what is there and work with what is there rather than grieving what is not there. He had been practical about this. Margaret had helped him be practical about it in her nursing way, which was the way of someone who had seen enough cases to know that the practical approach produced better outcomes than the other kind, and who was willing to say so in the clear, direct terms that practical approaches require. He had met Margaret in his 6th year at Fort Campbell at an event for soldiers' families. She was a nurse civilian, and she had come to the event because her brother was stationed at the fort and had asked her to come. She was 3 years older than him, and she had looked at him across the room with the expression of someone who has decided something and has not yet communicated it. He had walked across the room. They had been married the following year. Margaret had died 3 years ago. Not from anything dramatic, from a cancer that had been found early enough that it was supposed to be manageable, and that had not been manageable, which was the version of loss that did not resolve into a narrative. She had been a nurse for 30 years, and she had understood the prognosis before the doctors had finished explaining it. And she had spent the 14 months between the diagnosis and her death doing the things she wanted to do, which included telling their daughter everything she had not yet said, and talking to Reginald in the evenings with the specific completeness of two people who understand that the conversations they are having are the ones they will remember. He had moved to the smaller house 6 months after she died. The smaller house felt less full of her absence than the house where they had lived for 18 years. He kept the flag on the shelf above his desk in the smaller house. He had been going to the Memorial Day ceremony at Riverside Veterans Park for 19 years. He had gone the first time because he had heard about it and had thought I should go. He had gone the second time because he had met 2 veterans at the first ceremony who had served in units adjacent to his in the Gulf, and who had become the specific kind of friends that veterans become in the rooms and events where they recognize each other. He had gone every year after because it was the thing he did on Memorial Day, the way that some things become the thing you do without deciding in any given year that this will be the year you do it. Margaret had come with him starting in the 2nd year. She had said the first year that she was not a veteran and that the ceremony was for veterans and that she did not want to take space that was not hers to take. He had said, "You are a veteran's family. The ceremony is for veterans and their families." She had looked at him for a moment and then said, "All right." She had come every year after the first. She had stood in the family section with the specific attentiveness she brought to everything she considered worth attending, head turned toward the platform, hands at her sides or occasionally on his arm, saying nothing because the ceremony did not require commentary from its participants. She had loved the name reading. She had told him this in the 4th year. She had said, "The names are the real part. The rest is the frame. The names are the reason." He had agreed with her. He had thought about the names he knew not from this county specifically, but from 22 years of service, the men and women whose names were on the lists at other ceremonies in other places, the names that were spoken once in the reading and then held in the people who had known the people. He had not said this. He had simply agreed with her. Some things do not require addition. He arrived at the park at 10:45. The ceremony was at 11. He had allowed an extra 45 minutes because the accessible entrance at Riverside Veterans Park was on the far side of the parking lot from the main entrance, and he had learned in the past 2 years to allow for the time that accessible routes add to any journey that was previously planned for walking. He had not been resentful of this. He had been practical about it. You plan for the equipment you use. You allow for the time the equipment requires. He arrived at the park at 10:45. The ceremony was at 11. He had allowed an extra 45 minutes because the accessible entrance at Riverside Veterans Park was on the far side of the parking lot from the main entrance, and he had learned in the past 2 years to allow for the time that accessible routes add to any journey that was previously planned for walking. He had not been resentful of this. He had been practical about it. You plan for the equipment you use. You allow for the time the equipment requires. His daughter Keisha was with him. She was 38, and she had taken the morning off work for this, as she took it off every year, and she pushed the wheelchair on the sections of the path that were uphill, because the incline at the park entrance was steeper than the classification indicated, and he conserved his shoulder mobility for the parts of the route that required it. They had developed this choreography over 2 years. Without discussing it, she read the route and took the handle, and he let her without comment because the choreography was correct, and commentary would have made it self-conscious. The parking lot at Riverside Veterans Park on Memorial Day was the specific kind of full that comes from an event that draws both dedicated attendees and casual participants, the veterans and their families who have been coming for years, and the neighbors and community members for whom the ceremony is an annual neighborhood event. The accessible parking area was at the far end, as it always was, and Keisha had positioned the van correctly and deployed the ramp, and they had moved through the parking lot with the specific efficiency they had developed. Officer Marcus Webb had been parked in the lot since 9:30. He was 31 years old. He had been with the county sheriff's department for 5 years. He had been assigned to traffic and crowd control for the Memorial Day ceremony at Riverside Veterans Park, which was the standard deployment for this event. The department sent 2 officers each year, one for traffic at the main entrance and one for the parking lot perimeter. He had drawn the parking lot perimeter assignment. He had been briefed on the assignment the previous day. The briefing had covered the parking layout, the accessible area designations, the anticipated crowd size, and an incident from the previous year in which 2 non-veteran vehicles had used the veterans' priority parking area during the ceremony, creating a dispute that had required 20 minutes to resolve. The briefing officer had said if you see vehicles in the accessible or priority areas that don't appear to belong there, verify they're authorized. Webb had written this in his notes. He had written, verify authorization. He had not written approach veterans in wheelchairs and asked their daughters whether they served. The briefing had not covered that. The briefing had been about vehicles. Webb had arrived at the parking lot and had been in the lot for an hour and 15 minutes when Reginald and Keisha came through from the accessible parking area. And in that hour and 15 minutes, he had built a version of his assignment in his mind that had incorporated the briefing about vehicles into a broader sense of authority that extended to all people in the lot who required verification. This was not what the briefing had described. This was what Webb had assembled from it. Webb saw Reginald and Keisha moving through the parking lot toward the entrance path. He saw the wheelchair, the older man, the woman pushing. He drove his car slowly alongside them. He lowered his window. He said, "Sir, the main entrance is over there. This area is for accessible vehicles only." Keisha said evenly, "My father has a van in the accessible area." We parked in the accessible parking. Webb, the accessible path to the main area is through the north gate. Keisha, we know. We are going through the north gate. This is the route to the north gate from the accessible parking. Webb looked at them for a moment. He looked at the wheelchair. He looked at Reginald. He said, "Is he a veteran?" The sentence landed in the specific way that certain sentences land, not loud, not aggressive on its surface, but carrying in its structure an assumption that was visible to both Reginald and Keisha simultaneously. Is he a veteran? Not are you here for the ceremony. Not is there something I can help with. He, veteran. The question addressed to the daughter rather than to the man in the wheelchair. Reginald said, "I am." He said this in the voice he had used for 22 years in the Army, which was the voice of a master sergeant who has been the senior non-commissioned officer in the room for long enough that the voice is not performance, but posture. He said it to Webb directly because Webb had asked a question that was about him, and he was present and capable of answering questions about himself. Webb looked at him. He said, "Do you have ID?" Reginald, "I have my veteran's ID, my discharge papers, and the flag from my retirement ceremony in this bag. Which would you like to see?" Webb, veteran's ID is fine. Reginald opened the bag at the side of the wheelchair. He found the veteran's ID card, the card issued by the VA with his photograph and his branch and his dates of service. He held it out. Webb took it. He looked at it. He said, "This says Army." Reginald, "Yes." Webb, "We have a lot of people today who say they're veterans and aren't." Reginald was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. He thought about 22 years. He thought about Germany in January, and the Gulf in July, and Bosnia in the specific mud of the Bosnian spring, and Iraq in the heat that he had thought he understood from the Gulf, but that had been different in ways that mattered. He thought about the discharge ceremony, and the colonel who had read his service record, and the flag that was in the bag in the wheelchair. He thought about what it meant to be asked if the ID that said Army was real in a parking lot at a Veterans Memorial on Memorial Day, by a man who had asked his daughter if he was a veteran before he asked him. He thought about the soldiers he had led. He thought about their faces, the specific faces of the men and women who had been in his unit at various points across 22 years. The ones who had been with him in the Gulf, and the ones who had been with him in Iraq, and the ones who had not come home and whose names were on the lists that were read at ceremonies like this one every year in alphabetical order. He thought about what it would mean to one of those soldiers to know that their master sergeant at a Memorial Day ceremony in a park named for veterans had been asked in a parking lot whether the Army ID in his hand was real. He did not say any of this. He said, "I understand that you have a job to do. My ID is in your hand. My flag is in that bag. The ceremony begins in 14 minutes. Webb looked at him for a moment. Something moved in Webb's face in that moment. Not regret, not exactly, but the specific expression of a person who has just heard the gap between what they intended and what they did described to them in 3 sentences by someone who was not going to describe it again. Webb handed back the ID. He said, "Have a good one." He drove away. Keisha did not say anything until they had cleared the parking lot. She did not say anything because there was nothing to say that Reginald had not already said in the 3 sentences he had spoken in the parking lot, and because adding to those sentences would have diluted them. She was 38, and she had been her father's daughter for 38 years, and she had developed in those years the specific ability to know when the right response was silence and when it was presence. And right now, it was both. She pushed the wheelchair through the parking lot. She thought about her mother. She thought about what Margaret would have said in the parking lot if she had been there. She thought Margaret would have said something very short and very precise in the specific voice she used when she had decided that the shortest, accurate statement was the most powerful one. She thought Margaret would have said it to Webb directly without raising her voice with her nursing precision, and that Webb would have understood it immediately. She thought about this, and then she put it aside the way you put aside the things you cannot have, and she pushed the wheelchair toward the north gate. Keisha pushed the wheelchair the rest of the way to the north gate without speaking. She was 38 years old, and she had been her father's daughter for 38 years, and she had learned to read his silences the way you learn to read the silences of people who have spent their lives requiring themselves to be measured in situations that earned something less measured. The silence was not nothing. The silence was the weight of the 4 seconds, and the question about the Army and the flag in the bag. She pushed the wheelchair through the north gate. They found their position at the veterans section of the ceremony grounds, the area reserved for veterans and their families, with the chairs and the wider spacing and the sight line to the ceremonial platform. Several of the veterans recognized Reginald. A man in a Vietnam-era VFW cap nodded. A woman in an Army veteran jacket touched his shoulder. These were the specific greetings of people who have been coming to the same event for years and who know each other in the way that shared attendance over time produces knowing. The ceremony began at 11. The color guard was from the local ROTC unit. High school students in uniform moving with the particular precision of young people who have drilled this until they could do it in their sleep, and who understand from the practice, if not yet from the experience, the weight of what they are carrying. The honor guard was from the American Legion post that co-organized the event each year. A group of 7 veterans ranging in age from late 30s to mid-80s, all in uniform, all with the posture that military service builds in the body, and that does not leave when the service ends. The flag was raised slowly at the correct rate with the specific solemnity that flag ceremonies have when the people performing them understand why the rate matters. The anthem was sung by a woman from the County Arts Council who had been singing it at this ceremony for 7 years, and who had the voice for it, not performative, not theatrical, but full and direct, the voice of someone who is saying a true thing and wants it to be heard as a true thing rather than as a display. The names were read. The names of veterans from this county who had died in service since the previous year's ceremony. There were 6 names this year. The uniformed officer from the County Veterans Services Office read them in alphabetical order and said each name twice, once quickly as it appeared on the record, and once slowly as it deserved to be said, by someone who understood that the name was a person who had been alive and was no longer alive, and who had made a decision about their time that not everyone makes. The ceremony grounds went quiet between each name, the way that a gathering of several hundred people can go quiet when it understands that quiet is what the moment requires. Reginald heard the names the way he heard the names every year, not as an abstraction, but as a kind of counting. Counting in the specific way that a master sergeant counts, which is accounting for everyone under your care. The names were the ones who were no longer countable, the ones who had been in the count and were not now. He had known men who were on lists like this one. He had read the notifications and written the letters and gone to the memorial services with the specific weight of a senior non-commissioned officer who understood that writing the letter was part of the job and that it was the hardest part. The color guard was from the local ROTC unit. The honor guard was from the American Legion post that co-organized the event each year. The flag was raised and the anthem was played and the names were read. The names of veterans from this county who had died in service since the previous year's ceremony read in alphabetical order by a uniformed officer from the County Veterans Services Office who had learned over years of reading these lists how to say the names with the specific weight that each one deserved. When the names were finished, there was a moment of silence. In the moment of silence, Keisha leaned down to her father. She said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I am here." This was not the same as yes, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. After the moment of silence, the ceremony moved to the posting of the colors by the honor guard. This was the part of the ceremony that Reginald had come for every year, the part that had not diminished in its weight for him across 19 years of attendance. The flag is carried and posted with the specific deliberateness of a ceremony that understands that what it is doing is not representational but actual. The flag being posted is not a symbol of the things it represents. It is the thing itself carried by people who understand what carrying it requires. He thought about the first time he had participated in a flag ceremony as a soldier. He had been 23 years old in Germany at a base camp ceremony that was not Memorial Day, but that had the same quality of attention, the same specific weight of people who understand why they are doing the thing they are doing and who do not need the weight to be announced. He had stood at attention with the rest of his unit, and he had felt for the first time in uniform what it meant to be in a formation that was not about him individually, but about the thing that the formation represented, which was larger than any individual in it. He had carried that feeling for 41 years. The posting of the colors was moving through its sequence. The honor guard was at the flag stand. The color guard was at position. The assembly was at attention, the physical attention of several hundred people, orienting toward the same thing at the same moment, the specific quality of focus that ceremonies produce when they are conducted correctly. He had his hand on the bag at the side of the wheelchair. He felt the triangular case through the canvas. He thought about what it meant that the flag was here today in this bag at this ceremony. Keisha had asked if she could put it in the bag. He had said yes without asking why. He understood why now. He had understood why when she asked, and he had simply said yes because the yes was the correct answer, and it did not require elaboration. The flag was here because this was where it belonged on this day. It had been on the shelf above his desk for 31 years. It had been in the smaller house for 3 years through Margaret's death, and the adjustment to the wheelchair, and the first ceremony he had attended without her 2 years ago, when he had sat in the veterans section and had felt more clearly than he had expected to feel it the specific weight of her absence in a room where she had always been present. She had come with him every year until she couldn't. She had sat beside him in the veterans section with her hand on the arm of the wheelchair and her head turned toward the color guard with the specific attention she gave to things she considered real. The flag was here because she had always been here, and the flag was the closest physical thing he had to the fact of 22 years, and the closest physical thing he had to the record of who he had been before the wheelchair, and before the smaller house, and before the 14 months from diagnosis to the end. The flag was 31 years old, and it was the thing that had been through everything, and that did not require the context to be explained, because the context was folded into it in 14 folds that were made correctly by hands that understood what they were making. The honor guard began the posting. A woman named Celestine Davis saw what was happening from the veterans section. She was 61, a Navy veteran who had served for 18 years, and she had been at the ceremony for 12 of the 19 years that Reginald had been attending. She did not know exactly what had happened in the parking lot. She had not been there. But she had seen Reginald arrive with Keisha, and she had seen his face, and she had the specific ability after 30 years of knowing veterans and of being a veteran herself to read what a face was carrying that it was not saying. She had seen this look before. Not in Reginald specifically, she had not seen it in him before because in 12 years of seeing him at this ceremony he had never worn it. She had seen it in other veterans in other rooms at other times when something had happened in the approach to a ceremony that the ceremony itself could not acknowledge. The look was the look of a person who has been asked to prove something they have already proven, and who has done so, and who has carried the proof back to the ceremony where the proof should never have been required. She leaned over to the man beside her. His name was George Cole. He was a Vietnam veteran, an Army infantry veteran, 69 years old, and he was on the event committee that organized the ceremony each year. She said 3 sentences. George Cole sat for a moment after she finished speaking. He looked at Reginald across the veterans section. He stood up. He left the veterans section and walked to the event coordinator's table at the side of the ceremonial platform. The event coordinator was a woman named Patricia Hwang. She was not a veteran. She had been running the Riverside Veterans Park Memorial Day ceremony for 11 years, having taken over the coordination role from the man who had organized it for the preceding 12 years, and who had handed her a binder of logistics and a folder of historical photographs, and said, "This ceremony is real. Keep it real." She had spent 11 years keeping it real, which meant keeping the logistics correct, and keeping the relationships between the co-organizing organizations functional, and keeping the ceremony's attention on the people it existed to honor rather than on the administrative machinery that made it possible. She listened to what George told her. She asked 2 clarifying questions. She sat with what she had heard for approximately 30 seconds, which was the time it took her to determine what the correct response was. She walked to the microphone that was used for announcements between ceremony elements. She stood at the microphone. She had used this microphone for 11 years. She had used it for logistics announcements and schedule updates and the occasional moment of ceremony adjustment when weather or timing required it. She had never used it for anything like what she was about to use it for. She knew this. She had decided in 30 seconds that using it was correct. She said, "Before we conclude today's ceremony, I have been asked by several members of our veteran community to address something that occurred in the parking lot this morning." A veteran attending today's ceremony was asked in the parking lot whether he was a veteran by a county officer providing traffic and parking support. The question was asked about a master sergeant with 22 years of service who was attending his 19th Memorial Day ceremony at this park, and who had the flag from his retirement ceremony with him today. She paused. She said, "This ceremony exists to honor the people who served. Every person wearing a veteran's jacket or carrying a veteran's ID or simply sitting in the veterans section has already answered the question of whether they served. They answered it with the years they gave. We do not ask them to answer it again in the parking lot. The ceremony grounds were quiet in the way that a gathering of several hundred people can be quiet, not silent, but held. She said, "Master Sergeant Reginald Moss, if you are willing, would you bring your flag to the platform?" Keisha put her hand on the wheelchair handle. She looked at her father. He was looking at the platform. He was looking at it with the expression she had last seen on his face at the Fort Campbell reunion 3 years ago, the expression of a man who has put something away and is being asked to bring it out again, and who is deciding whether bringing it out is what he wants to do. She had seen this expression, and she had understood it. She was 38 years old, and she knew her father's face the way you know the faces of the people who have been constant in your life. He was going to do it. She could see him deciding it. She could see the moment when the decision was complete. He took the triangular case from the bag. He held it in his lap. The canvas of the bag had been warm from the morning sun. The triangular case was cool, the way wood and fabric are cool when they have been kept in a specific place and have taken on the temperature of that place. He had held this case before. He had held it at the discharge ceremony when the colonel presented it. He had held it when they moved from the first apartment to the second, and when they bought the house, and when they moved to the smaller house after Margaret. He had held it once, late at night, after the first year in the wheelchair, when the question of what his life now was had been particularly present, and he had needed to hold something that confirmed what his life had been. He held it now in his lap in the veterans section of Riverside Veterans Park on Memorial Day. And he thought about the parking lot and the question about the Army, and the 4 seconds he had spent before he answered, and he thought about bringing the case out being the correct decision. Keisha pushed the wheelchair to the base of the platform. There was no ramp to the platform itself. The platform was elevated, but the event coordinator had stepped off the platform and was standing at ground level, and the honor guard had moved to the ground level, and the assembly of several hundred people had oriented itself toward this moment, the way that assemblies orient toward things they recognize as significant, without being told that they are significant. He looked at the assembly. Several hundred people, veterans and their families, and the community members who came to this ceremony because the ceremony was real, and because real things draw people who understand what real means. He saw Celestine Davis, who had leaned over to George Cole and said 3 sentences that had produced this moment. He saw George Cole. He saw the man in the Vietnam-era VFW cap whose name he did not know, but whose face he recognized from 19 years of this ceremony. He held the case out. The event coordinator took it. She took it with both hands, the careful 2-handed hold of someone who understands what she has been given. She turned to face the assembly. She said this flag was presented to Master Sergeant Reginald Moss 31 years ago at his retirement ceremony at Fort Campbell. He served for 22 years. He has kept this flag for 31 years. He brought it here today because this is where it belongs. She paused. She said, "We are grateful." The honor guard saluted. The 7 veterans in their uniforms ranging from their late 30s to their mid-80s brought their hands to the salute position with the specific precision of people who have saluted many things and know the difference between a formal salute and a salute that means something in the moment it is given. The veterans in the veterans section responded the way the veterans section responds to a moment it recognizes as true. Those who could stand stood, and those who could not stand placed their hands on their hearts, and some of them did both at once. The hand over the heart while they rose from the chair with the effort that older bodies make and the refusal to acknowledge the effort that older veterans make. Celestine Davis placed her hand on her heart and did not look away from the flag. George Cole stood with his hand on his heart and his head turned toward Reginald. Keisha stood beside the wheelchair. She had her hands over her heart and tears that she was not going to contain. and did not try to contain, because containing them would have required pretending that this moment was ordinary, and it was not ordinary, and she was not going to pretend. Reginald sat in the wheelchair and held himself straight with the posture of 22 years of wearing a uniform, and he looked at the flag in the event coordinator's hands, and he did not look away. He thought about Germany. He thought about the Gulf. He thought about Bosnia in the spring mud. He thought about Iraq. He thought about the colonel at Fort Campbell who had read his service record before the ceremony and had said, "You carried this well." He thought about Margaret in the veterans section with her hand on the arm of the wheelchair and her head turned toward the flag. He thought about the 4 seconds in the parking lot and what he had thought during those 4 seconds. He thought about the word well. He had carried this well. He was still carrying it. The ceremony concluded at 12:41. Keisha stood beside the wheelchair for a long moment after the honor guard completed the posting. She was still. He was still. The assembly around them was beginning to move through the quiet dispersal that a ceremony's end produces, the specific movement of several hundred people who have been held in attention and are now releasing themselves from it gradually, because releasing from something real takes more time than it took to enter it. He put his hand on the bag. The flag case was warm from the sun, now warmer than when they had arrived. He thought about the event coordinator's 2-handed hold. He thought about the honor guard's salute. He thought about Celestine's hand on her heart. He thought about the parking lot, the 4 seconds, and what had come from them. He thought, all right. Reginald and Keisha remained in the veterans section for 30 minutes after the conclusion. This was not unusual. The ceremony's end was generally followed by a period of informal gathering, the veterans who had been coming for years, finding each other in the loose assembly of people who have been through something together and are not quite ready to leave. Several veterans came to Reginald in that 30 minutes. Not to discuss the parking lot, most of them knew only the outline of what had happened, the 3 sentences that Celestine had said, and the version those sentences had transmitted through the veterans section. They came because the moment with the flag had been visible, and because visible moments in a veterans ceremony draw the people who understood what made them visible. Celestine came. She said, "I am glad you brought it." He said, "My daughter put it in the bag." She said, "I know. She told me." He looked at Keisha. Keisha had talked to Celestine while he had been speaking with George Cole. Keisha had a story he did not have all of. He would ask her on the drive home. He did not ask her now. George Cole came. He said, "I want you to know that what Patricia did was her decision. I told her what happened. She decided. I did not ask her to do what she did." Reginald said, "I know that." George said, "I thought you should know." Reginald said she did the right thing. George said yes. They sat for a moment in the specific silence of 2 Army veterans who have said what they needed to say. The formal response to what had happened in the parking lot was initiated by 2 members of the veterans community on the afternoon of the ceremony, Celestine Davis and George Cole. They drove from the park to the County Sheriff's Department's Community Liaison Office, which was open on Memorial Day, because the county had scheduled 2 public ceremonies that required liaison office support. They filed a written account. The account described the interaction in the parking lot, the question addressed to Keisha rather than to Reginald, the challenge to the ID, the specific sentence about veterans who say they served when they did not. The account was signed by both of them and submitted within 2 hours of the ceremony's conclusion. They did not ask Reginald if they could file it. They told him they were going to file it. He had said all right. He had not offered to come with them. He had known they did not need him to come. The filing was their act. They had witnessed it, and they were responding to it, and the response was theirs to make. The Sheriff's Department opened an inquiry within 48 hours. The assigned investigator was a lieutenant named Carl Harris, who had been with the department for 19 years, and who had handled community relations inquiries for the past 5. He reviewed Webb's patrol log for the morning, which noted the interaction but did not describe the specific language used. He reviewed the accounts submitted by Celestine Davis and George Cole, both detailed, both specific about the sequence, both signed and dated. He reviewed the briefing materials that Webb had received the day before the ceremony and found the note about verifying authorization for parking spaces and noted that the briefing had addressed vehicles, not persons. He interviewed Webb on the third day. Webb's account confirmed the interaction. He described his reasoning. He had been briefed to verify authorization in the accessible and priority parking areas. He had seen two people moving through the lot, one in a wheelchair, and he had driven alongside to verify. He said he had not intended to challenge the veteran's service. He said he had not thought about how the question sounded when it was addressed to the daughter rather than to the man. Harris wrote in his notes, "Webb appears to be describing his actions accurately. He does not appear to understand why the actions were problematic. This is a training gap, not a character problem." Harris wrote this distinction into the finding because the distinction mattered for what the correct response was. A training gap is corrected through training. A character problem requires a different response. Webb had a training gap. The briefing had addressed vehicles. The training had not addressed how to interact with veteran attendees at a ceremony honoring veterans. The gap was real and had produced a real consequence, and the consequence was not Webb's alone. The gap was the institution's. The inquiry's finding was not disciplinary in the formal sense. Webb received a counseling session with his watch captain and a written note in his file describing the interaction and the conduct guidance provided. He was required to complete the department's community relations training module, which included a section on veteran interactions at public events. The finding noted that while Webb's stated intent was not disrespectful, the effect of the interaction, asking the daughter whether the man in the wheelchair was a veteran rather than asking the man himself and then challenging the ID, by noting that people falsely claim veteran status, created an experience that was inconsistent with the department's stated values regarding veteran community relations. Harris added a recommendation to his finding. He recommended that all future deployments to veteran events include a pre-event briefing that specifically addressed veteran attendee interaction, not vehicle verification, but human interaction. He recommended that the briefing include the principle that veteran attendees are to be presumed veterans. He recommended that the briefing be developed in consultation with the County Veterans Services Office. The recommendation was adopted. The first briefing that incorporated it was delivered the following November at a Veterans Day ceremony at a different county park. The County Veterans Services Director used the incident in her annual address to the county commissioners. She did not name Webb or Reginald. She described the type of interaction the question asked about, rather than to a veteran in a wheelchair. The ID challenged the comment about false claims. She said, "Our veterans have answered the question of whether they served. They answered it with their years. We do not require them to re-answer it in our parking lots on Memorial Day." The county commissioners adopted a formal resolution affirming that county-organized events honoring veterans would include explicit protocol guidance for all personnel providing event support, specifying that veteran attendees were to be treated with the presumption of their service and that verification of veteran status was not appropriate for standard event access. The resolution was not retroactive and was not punitive toward Webb. It was forward-looking, which is the form that these resolutions take when the people writing them understand that what they are doing is making the next incident less likely, rather than responding to the current one. The resolution was 4 paragraphs. The second paragraph contained the specific language that Celestine Davis had suggested when she was asked by the Veterans Services Director for her input on the draft. The paragraph said, "Personnel providing event support at county-sponsored events honoring veterans shall presume that veterans attending such events are veterans, and shall treat all veteran attendees with the deference appropriate to their service." Celestine had said the deference appropriate to their service. That sentence. That has to be in there. The director had put it in. Reginald read the resolution when it was adopted. Keisha had sent him the document. He read it at the desk in the smaller house with the flag on the shelf above him. He read it carefully, the way he read things he considered worth reading carefully, slowly, not just for information, but for understanding of how the words were arranged and what the arrangement said about what the people who wrote them understood. He read the paragraph about presumption of service. He read the paragraph about deference. He sat for a moment after he finished reading. He thought about the 4 seconds in the parking lot. He thought about the colonel at Fort Campbell. He thought about Margaret. He thought about Keisha's hands over her heart. He put the document on the desk beside him. He looked at the flag on the shelf. He thought, all right, that's correct. That's how it should be stated. He had not needed the resolution to know that he was a veteran. He had known it for 41 years. The resolution stated it in the language of formal policy, which is a different kind of knowing, not personal knowledge, but institutional acknowledgement, the kind that changes what happens to the next person in the parking lot, rather than the person who was already in it. He understood the difference. He had spent 22 years in an institution that ran on formal policy. He understood what formal policy did and what it could not do. And he understood that this resolution was doing the thing that formal policy does when it is written correctly, which is make the next person's experience less likely to require a ceremony to correct. Reginald attended the ceremony the following year. He had called Celestine in February to ask if she was going. She had said, of course. He had said, I will see you there. She had said, bring the flag. He had not thought about whether to bring the flag. He had put it back on the shelf after the previous year's ceremony, and it had lived on the shelf through the fall and the winter and into the spring. He had looked at it more often this year than in previous years, not because anything had changed about the flag, but because he had looked at the desk more often in general, the way that objects accumulate significance from the events that occur around them. The flag had been in the bag at the ceremony. The flag had been in the event coordinator's hands. The flag had been in front of several hundred people at a ceremony that had stopped to acknowledge it. The flag was still the same flag. It held more now. He put it in the bag on the morning of the ceremony. Keisha arrived at 8:45. She came in through the front door the way she always came in without knocking because she had grown up in a version of this house, and this was the version of the door she came through. She saw the bag with the flag case visible at the top. She said, good. He said, your mother would have said the same thing. She said, I know. She taught me. They drove to the ceremony. She drove. He sat in the passenger seat with the bag between his feet, the flag case visible at the top. She had chosen the same route they had taken every year, the route that went past the park entrance early enough to see the first arrivals and the flag being positioned, and the setup teams doing the final preparations for the ceremony. He had always liked to see the preparation. There was something in the preparation that reminded him of the preparation for anything significant. The attention to the details before anyone is watching the making ready that does not require an audience, because the preparation is done for the thing itself, rather than for the people who will see the result. He watched the setup teams through the window as they passed. He saw the color guard practicing the flag approach. He saw the chairs being arranged in the veterans section. He saw the accessible parking area, the expanded section, and he noted it without saying anything. She said they fixed the incline. He said, I see that. She said, good. They parked and deployed the ramp and moved through the lot. There was no officer alongside them this year. There was an officer at the main entrance visible from the accessible parking area doing the traffic work that the ceremony required. The accessible path was clear and correctly maintained, and the gate was open at the correct width, and the morning was the morning of a ceremony that was doing what it was supposed to do. He moved through the gate. The flag was in the bag on the side of the wheelchair. Celestine was already in the veterans section when they arrived. The accessible path had been repaved between the 2 years. The incline at the north gate had been corrected to meet the accessible design standard, which Keisha noticed immediately because the year before she had needed to put her full weight into the push for that last section of the incline, and this year she did not. The accessible parking area had been expanded by 6 spaces. He did not know if these improvements were connected to what had happened at the ceremony the year before. They might have been scheduled independently. He was not in a position to know. He noted them. He noted the repaved path and the corrected incline and the additional parking, and he allowed himself the small satisfaction of a man who knows the difference between things that are there because someone was paying attention and things that are there because they were always going to be there. He thought they were there because someone was paying attention. He did not need to know for certain. Keisha pushed the wheelchair through the north gate on the repaved path, and they found their position in the veterans section, and the veterans who had been there the year before recognized them and greeted them with the specific greetings of people who know what the previous year had held. The ceremony began at 11. The names were read. In the moment of silence, Keisha leaned down. She said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I am here." He was here. He had been here for 20 years now. He would come for as long as he could come because the ceremony was real, and the people in it were real, and the flag and the bag at the side of the wheelchair was real, and the 22 years behind it were real. And real things do not require revalidation in a parking lot. After the ceremony, he and Keisha stayed again for the informal gathering. Celestine found them in the veterans section within 5 minutes of the conclusion. She said, "You brought it." He said, "You told me to." She said, "I told you to because it's the right thing to bring." He said, "I know." She sat beside the wheelchair and they talked for 20 minutes. They talked about the ceremony and the names that had been read, and the people who had come that neither of them had seen the year before. They talked about Celestine's grandchildren who had come this year for the first time, and who had stood in the assembly and had watched the color guard with the wide-eyed attention of children who are seeing something for the first time, and understanding that they are supposed to understand why it matters. Celestine said, "My granddaughter asked me afterward who the soldiers were. I told her they were the people who made it possible for us to be here. She said, even the ones in the wheelchair. I said, especially the ones in the wheelchair." He said, "Thank you." She said, "I just told her the truth." They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of two veterans who have been talking for 12 years at a ceremony and who know the difference between silence that is empty and silence that contains things that do not need to be said. The county's official event report for the second year noted the expanded accessible parking, the repaved path, and the corrected incline as infrastructure improvements made between the two ceremonies. It noted them without connecting them to any specific incident. The connection was not documented in the official report. It lived in the conversations that had happened after the previous year's ceremony in the letter that Patricia Hwang had sent to the County Parks Department in August in the Veterans Services Director's conversation with the county administrator in the specific way that things change when the right people have a conversation, and the conversation produces an action, and the action produces a result that is real the next time a wheelchair comes through the gate. The flag was in the bag on the side of the wheelchair. Keisha pushed the wheelchair toward the exit. The north gate was easier on the way out than it had been the year before. She said, "Better path." He said, "Yes." She said, "Next year." He said, "Next year." They simply are. They have always been. They will continue to be the thing they are regardless of who asks the question, or how many times the question is asked. He placed his hand on the flag case. The flag was warm through the canvas. The sun had been on the bag since the ceremony began, and the warmth had transferred through the canvas to the wooden case. He thought about what the flag had been through. He thought about the 14 folds. He thought about the colonel's hands, and the ceremonial team's hands, and his own hands when he had received it at Fort Campbell. He thought about Margaret's hands when she had held it during the move to the smaller house, saying, "I'll carry this one," and carrying it the way she carried things she considered important, which was carefully and without being asked whether she needed help. The flag was 31 years old, and it had been through a parking lot this morning, and it was here, and it was still itself, and so was he. The honor guard moved to post the colors. The assembly rose. Those who could rise rose and faced the flag. He looked at Celestine, who was on her feet with her hand over her heart, and her face turned toward the flag with the attention of someone who has been through enough to know what attention means. He looked at George Cole standing beside her. He looked at the man in the Vietnam-era VFW cap, standing with both hands on the cap, which he had removed for the ceremony. He looked at Keisha beside him, both hands over her heart. her face turned upward, her tears visible in the midday light. He held himself straight. He was here. Some things that are earned over 22 years cannot be taken from you by someone who read the ID and still had a question. The 22 years are not in the ID. They are in the posture and the silence and the way you sit at a ceremony and hold yourself straight, because 22 years of wearing a uniform built a posture that does not require a uniform to hold. The flag in the bag is not the thing. The thing is the man who carried it in the rain in Bosnia and the heat of Iraq and the cold of Germany and the parking lot on Memorial Day, and who brought it to this ceremony for the 21st time, and who will bring it again. The thing is Keisha's hands over her heart. The thing is Celestine saying, "I told you to bring it because it's the right thing to bring." The thing is the repaved path and the expanded parking and the briefing that now includes the specific instruction presume that veterans attending veteran events are veterans. The thing is the resolution adopted by the county commissioners, 4 paragraphs, the second one with the sentence about the deference appropriate to service. All of these things came from a moment in a parking lot where a man who had served for 22 years held himself still for 4 seconds, and then said in the voice he had used in 4 deployments, "I understand that you have a job to do. My flag is in that bag. The ceremony begins in 14 minutes. The ceremony began. He was there for it. He was here now. He would be here next year." The ceremony at Riverside Veterans Park happens every year on the last Monday of May. It begins at 11 and concludes at approximately 12:45 and is attended by several hundred people from the county veterans and their families and the community members who come because they understand what the ceremony is for and who want to be in the room where the true thing is being honored. The name reading happens near the middle. The color posting happens near the end. The accessible path from the expanded accessible parking area to the north gate is level now and correctly maintained, and has been since the year after the year, with the parking lot and the 4 seconds and the flag in the bag. Reginald is in the veterans section. The flag is in the bag on the side of the wheelchair. He is here. He is always here. Subscribe our channel. We tell the stories of the people who kept showing up to the ceremony and what the ceremony looked like when it finally got the moment right.